Good morning. My name is Julien Lafortune, and I'm a research fellow at the Public Policy Institute of California. Welcome to our virtual program this morning, featuring the findings from PPIC's latest report, assessing transitional kindergarten's impact on elementary school trajectories. The report, technical appendices, policy brief, and slides from today's briefing can be found at our website, ppic.org. The research and event presented today are supported with funding from Sunlight Giving. We'd like to thank them for their support. And as a reminder, PPIC is a public charity, and it does not take or support positions on any ballot measure or legislation, nor does it support, endorse, or oppose any political parties or candidates for public office. For today's presentation, I will first present the main findings from our report. I'll then be joined by my colleague and report co-author Laura Hill, and together we will discuss key takeaways and answer questions from our virtual audience. If you have a question, please send it along with your name and organization to the email address on the screen, ppiceventquestions@gmail.com. And now on to the presentation. So today we're presenting our work looking at transitional kindergarten on elementary school trajectories. And as I mentioned, this is joint with my colleague Laura Hill and supported with funding from Sunlight Giving. And so just a little bit of background on transitional kindergarten in California. So transitional kindergarten, or TK, is part of the K through 12 system, and it's essentially an extra year of schooling or an extra year of kindergarten. It was launched in 2012-13 with limited eligibility, and now kind of going through 2025-26, it's been recently expanded and will be universal by 25-26. And what's a little bit different about TK compared to kindergarten is that it is an age-appropriate curriculum. So it's meant for 4-year-olds or those who are close to age 5. It's at least 3 hours a day, although sometimes TK can encompass a full day program. Some classrooms do mix TK and kindergarten, and there are often lower staffing ratios than early elementary grades like kindergarten or first or second grade. And I'll just want to highlight, and this will be key to kind of understanding and interpreting both the landscape and our results, that this is one of many options that children and their parents face for 4-year-old care and education. And so there's California State Preschool, there's Head Start, of course, there's private preschool options and home care, and this is just one of the many options that's available for 4-year-olds. And so far, what do we know about TK? Well, we have some evidence from the initial launch of TK and the initial cohorts in TK in California, and generally those tended to find improved kindergarten readiness on a number of dimensions. So kids were entering kindergarten with kind of more skills as measured by a variety of exams and other metrics. Nationally, when we look beyond TK and look at early childhood education for those who are 3- and 4-year-old before entering kindergarten, we tend to find generally positive impacts. So research has identified a number of short and long-run benefits. This includes kind of academics and test scores, but also things like high school graduation, college attendance, earnings, as well as things that are kind of more behavioral or social emotional. One thing I'll point out, and this is also true in some but not all of the literature on early childhood education, is that sometimes the academic benefits that accrue in early grades like kindergarten or first grade sometimes fade out in 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th grade. Although this is true even in settings that have robust long-run improvements by the end of high school and even into college. And so in this study, we're focused on TK and its impact on student trajectories through elementary school, and we focus on 5 districts. So we're using 5 large urban districts in California. We're not allowed to name the districts that we use, but just to know kind of the sample that we have, these are 5 large districts. We're looking at cohorts that were enrolled in TK before the COVID-19 pandemic, and we're following these cohorts through elementary school. And we examined several dimensions or several outcomes. So we look specifically at the identification or classification of dual language or English learners. We also look at the identification and the timing of identification of special education needs. We also have available standardized test scores in math and ELA, as well as social and emotional scores from a survey that's given to students. And then we look at differences across demographic groups, be it by income or by language or parental education. And so to identify the impact that TK has had, we need to use a kind of careful design. And so the main kind of empirical problem that we'll face is that parents choose whether they opt in or out of TK. And so only looking at those who took TK may give us a biased impact. And so the solution that we'll employ in this study, and is what's common in other studies of TK and in the broader early childhood literature, is to leverage the fact that there's a birth date cutoff in the period that we're studying. In the period that we're studying, those born on or before December 2nd were eligible for TK. Those born after were not. And so we're going to compare outcomes of students born, December 1st versus December 3rd that have different propensities of taking up TK, but end up in the same kindergarten classroom at age 5 in the following year. And one thing to note about this is that the impact that we're measuring here is then going to be relative to the alternatives. So we don't know what those 4-year-olds who didn't take up TK did instead, but the impact of TK that we measure is going to be kind of conditioned or is going to depend on those, those options, which could have been high quality options as well, like the state preschool, like Head Start, for which there's much research identifying positive impacts. And so when we look at just kind of the difference in TK enrollment across this December cutoff, you can see in this chart that there's a really large difference across the cutoff. And so about 70 to 75% born just days before December 3rd in our district are taking up TK, whereas about 20% or less are taking TK if they're born later. And if we look kind of earlier in our sample, the share that took TK after December 3rd was closer to 0. There was an expansion of what was called, early transitional kindergarten or expanded TK, ETK, that began in some of the later years of our sample in some of the districts that we studied. But overall, being born just a few days different or later in December is associated with a really, really large decrease, about 50 percentage points decrease in your propensity to enroll in transitional kindergarten. And that's the empirical design that we'll use to leverage impacts. And so when we look at these students just in a narrow bandwidth or a narrow range of birthdays right around that cutoff, we first look at English learner status and English learner identification as it's measured by the district. And we find that EL identification is more common in TK than it is in kindergarten. And so there's actually a gap. More students are ever identified as English learners. You can see almost 40% are in TK. And then, compared to only about 30% of those who didn't enroll in TK but start in kindergarten. And so there's a gap there that in the share that are, English learners in kindergarten and first grade. And then by second grade, the difference fades out and there's kind of no difference. Another way to look at this is to use our kind of more precise or more robust estimates that use, instead of just looking at averages, look right at the difference at this cutoff. And so this is, these are our kind of main causal estimates here. We find that there's a little bit lower than a 10% increase in being ever identified as an English learner. And that's mainly showing up in kind of kindergarten and first grade. By second grade, there's no difference in the English learner status or likelihood between those that took TK and those that did not take up TK. Similarly, when we look at special education needs, we see that a lot are identified initially in TK, the share continues to rise, and eventually by grades 3, 4, 5, there's not really much of a difference. But the difference that emerges is in the timing of identification. Those who enroll in TK were identified earlier with special education needs, though they weren't identified at higher rates overall by the time we get to the end of elementary school. And so just to kind of highlight some of these key findings on the English learners and the special education identification, again, we find earlier and a higher likelihood of ever being identified as an English learner or a dual language learner, but that difference kind of fades away by grade 2. When we look at students with disabilities, we see no impact on ever being identified as having a special education need, but we do see earlier identification, and that's specifically centered in our study. What we find is that's specifically centered on those identified with autism or speech and language needs. And this is the most notable, actually, this difference driven by TK, or the impact of TK on identification timing, is most notable when we split and look specifically at students with non-English home languages who are identified a little bit more than a grade earlier with autism and speech and language needs, even though they're not more likely to ever be identified. So when we turn to test scores, we end up finding, kind of small and insignificant impacts here. So the graph here is showing you all the way from the left, both kind of math and English language arts scores pooled together, then just ELA in the middle and math on the right. And we don't see a very large difference. They're small and statistically insignificant. When we turn to social and emotional impacts, they look to be a little bit larger or more, kind of modest to large, depending on the impact. or the type of metric used. But again, they're statistically insignificant, although maybe self-efficacy looks like it shows a little bit more of a positive impact. But when we split the sample by those who enter TK or kindergarten as English-only students and those who have another home language who we're calling multilingual, we see that there's actually big differences in the impact, specifically on social and emotional learning. And so those who are English-only see large improvements that are statistically significant overall social and emotional metrics, and especially for social awareness, whereas those who are multilingual see insignificant and even sometimes slightly negative impacts on their social and emotional outcomes. And so just to kind of summarize, and we'll get to some of these we'll discuss some of the takeaways in greater detail in a few moments. But we see that this earlier identification of special education and English learner needs is a promising area to promote and improve services and outcomes. This could be beneficial for both special education students and for EL students, but it could also mean for English learner students that we may be over-identifying students, especially given that we see this increase in ever being identified as an EL. Now, we do find when it comes to test scores that these initial benefits that were documented in earlier studies seem to fade out by grades 3 and 4. We do want to mention these are relative impacts relative to alternatives, which are also other high quality options. At the same time, these are also estimates specific to some of the earliest TK cohorts, and there have been a lot of changes over time. And so we may not think that the kind of TK that was that students were receiving 8, 9, 10 years ago is the same TK that students are receiving now. And then finally, this suggested benefit of evidence of social and emotional benefits that we see is really limited to English-only students. And so that suggests an area of improvement in that there are benefits for some students, but for multilingual students, what is kind of happening in TK doesn't seem to be leaning to those same benefits. And so I'll pause now and just remind you, if you have additional questions, you can submit them to ppiceventquestions@gmail.com. And I'll stop sharing my screen and now invite my colleague, Laura Hill, to join me to discuss some key takeaways.
Thanks, Julien. That was great. We'd love for us to spend a little bit more time digging into some questions around dual language learners and English learners and what it means for them to be identified at higher rates and have this additional time in EL services. And I just have some thoughts. I'll start off there. I think it's a really good question about whether they're being over-identified. But another important question is over-identification better than possibly missing the chance to find students and provide services? I'm thinking of that question. I have some comfort in that the reclassification is happening quite quickly because we're looking at them in second grade. They're really no higher rate of still being in EL status. So that seems promising. And it is true that the screening mechanism that helps determine if a student needs English learner support services might not really be ideal for 4-year-olds, although I know we have been using it that way for quite some time, whether it was the CELT in the past in the era that we're looking at, or if it's the LPAC, because it used to be that these kind of old 4-year-olds were actually in kindergarten, and we were screening them with this type of screener before. And just so the audience knows that, yes, this is trying to assess, this assessment is trying to figure out if students need supportive services in English language, but at this grade level, it's not about reading and writing, it's more about speaking and listening. So at least in that way, it is tailored to kind of not over-identify students that are not yet reading in English at the age of 4, thankfully. Just to see if, Julien, if you have anything you want to add or other thoughts?
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think that, we've heard when we've kind of presented these findings, earlier versions, we've kind of heard mixed reception to that, in part because there's this concern over, over identification, perhaps leading to stigma. But at the same time, from the kind of K-12 funding perspective, there's more funding for these students as well. There's more that the schools can then do to support these students. And these additional supports, may end up being kind of beneficial. So I think that, that even there's the concern over identification, but at the same time, the silver lining is that these students are getting greater resources, the schools are getting greater resources for these students, and it looks like it's not a persistent state of remaining kind of in English language learner services for a long time, and perhaps getting kind of trapped in that cycle.
Let's dig in a little bit more now to the lack of test score gains, or at least the small and insignificant ones that we observed. So I think we've kind of already addressed this, but Julien, what's your take? Does this mean that test scores that TK isn't working?
No, I mean, I think, the key thing to remember and again, our study's looking at just 5 districts, so it's certainly not a statewide portrait. But it's also looking relative to the early childhood education options that students were receiving and continue to receive that aren't attending TK. And that can include the state preschool and Head Start and other, private preschools. And so if a student is attending a high quality option and they switch into TK, if they're going from private to public, that may result in a lot of family savings, but that may not necessarily mean that they're going to see significant benefits, especially when we start looking out at, test scores in 3rd and 4th grade. A lot of the research on early childhood education anyway, more generally, tends to think that, some of the metrics that are kind of more social emotional or behavioral are the ones that persist over time as well. And so to the extent that, students are provided with these additional options, and they're certainly not doing worse relative to a lot of other high quality options, I think that's a strong, indication that, it's certainly not it's not that it's not working, and it's kind of working perhaps as intended or expected.
And we, at this point, aren't able to look at some of those farther out outcomes. So it's a wait and see. And again, not doing worse than the alternative. So I think that sums it up. It seems that we are getting some questions. I wonder if we should pivot to that now. Just want to remind folks that we are taking questions at the email PPIC eventquestions@gmail.com. And with that, we'll turn to some of those questions. The first one is, Julien, we find that TK creates some positive outcomes, but how much of that do you think is dependent on teacher quality, like teacher-student ratios? And do we think this will continue during the expansion?
Yeah, and that, I think this is the kind of the key question, and I mentioned interpreting results relative to these alternatives. The downside of the data that we study, and really a lot of the ability to study TK in other settings, certainly using statewide or district level data, is that there's not always a good accounting or good sense of what, the conditions of these programs are. Are they full day? Are they half day? Which programs are bilingual or multilingual, and what are the support services for different students? What are the kind of class sizes, the credentials of teachers? I think there's a whole lot of information that we'd like to know about this trajectory, especially, looking forward and not just backwards at these initial cohorts, but how is TK expansion progressing? What are the conditions in these classrooms? What services are being provided, and where, and perhaps where there are some gaps, to understand, not just kind of what the quality is at right now, but what might be needed to improve the quality as well. As this becomes a grade as a part of the system, the now, TK-12 system, I think like every other grade, we'll want to continue looking to try to understand, are we providing students with the kind of, the most impactful services and resources that we can.
Great. And here's a new question. I think I'll take this one. It's from Kelly Rain Collin from Healthy Minds Consulting. And she would like us to talk about if we have any ideas about how to better support the social emotional needs of English language learners in TK. I think that's a great question, and one that we really wanted to tease out a good bit more in the research, but we unfortunately don't have a lot more information about what's going on in the classroom. We think that one way to really, as Julien just mentioned, improve the analysis and understand how things are working would be to have more data about what kinds of English language development programs students in TK are receiving. And of course, that's going to vary from place to place. We did see some suggestive evidence that dual language learners who were in schools with large populations or high percentages of dual language learners there actually did have slightly more positive outcomes when it came to social emotional learning. So that suggests that, there really are some ways in which these outcomes might be improved for these students. So that's something we really want to keep our eyes on the ball with going forward. Let's see. I think we have another question. This one is from Zadie Stavely at EdSource. And she asks, is it possible that the higher number of EL students in TK is because they have not yet learned English, but that those who enroll in kindergarten might be learning English in preschool, so they test out of EL status and are not identified? I would say, yes, that is possible. We don't really know what the alternatives are. So it would be, it probably varies quite a bit. Some students might be getting access to preschool beforehand. That does increase their English skills, and they are older and a grade level kind of ahead. I think that that's definitely possible. Julien, do you have anything you want to add there?
No, I mean, and I think that speaks to, in a way that's kind of, speaks to the issue of over-identification that's sometimes brought up in these contexts. When you test, students are learning language, developing language at 4 and 5 and continuing to. And so when we're testing them, earlier and earlier, we might identify that more are not, kind of up to these levels of English proficiency that we've identified as being the kind of cutoffs to, being an English learner as opposed to a student that is deemed kind of initially fluent. And so that's something I think, especially, as TK is expanding, right, to younger and younger 4-year-olds, that, the state will probably need to give some thought as to what the right, what the right metric is, or whether that's an exam or something else, and what the cutoff should be, and, how to kind of assess the language development that's age appropriate. In a few years, we'll have TK students that are starting. If they start in August, they'll actually, some of them will actually be 3 by the time that they're starting. And so that's a lot different from, the way that we've traditionally handled kind of language, language identification or language needs identification going into kindergarten.
That's a good point. And Julien, there's a follow-up from Zadie, and I know you've thought about this, so I'm gonna give it to you. It's I've seen research in the past that shows multilingual students actually have higher social emotional readiness than English only students. When this study finds no impacts on multilingual students, could that be because they're already at a higher level?
Yeah, it's a good question. And when we looked at it in our sample, and again, we're looking not at social emotional readiness in kindergarten, but we're looking at this in 3rd and 4th and 5th grade. And by then we didn't see large differences among those who are kind of English only versus multilingual in 3rd and 4th and 5th grade. But we did see some, the differences that we saw seemed, to emerge based on those who had TK or not. And so it wasn't so much an average difference. It's really reflecting, those who were born just a few days or before or after the cutoff seem to have kind of discrete, propensity to have higher or lower scores on SEL. And so we're not just it's not just an average impact. It really looks like it's something differential kind of happening for those students around, that are kind of eligible or not for TK. But again, that could be true entering kindergarten, and that could be one of the reasons that maybe we're seeing, some of these differential impacts, that maybe those that are English only are kind of more prepared to enter the transitional kindergarten at that age, are more prepared for that type of setting, and so they benefit more than those who aren't, multilingual students who maybe aren't as prepared for the, socially and emotionally for the more, the slightly different type of early care setting than they may have been receiving before.
Great. Now we have a question from San Francisco. How might COVID have affected what you found? What is happening now for the cohorts of students that were enrolled in TK during the height of the pandemic? I'll start off and just say, most of the outcomes we looked at were prior to COVID. So we were looking at students who started TK before COVID, and we were looking at their test scores, for example. Those were all pre-COVID test scores. Some of the social emotional measures were post-COVID, but we're comparing students just on either side of this birth date cutoff. So they should have experienced COVID similarly. So we don't think that that's really going to impact our findings. And then when it comes to what's going on now, we do know, students obviously who were sent home on Zoom would have had a different experience, and that there was a lot of under enrollment in TK during those early COVID cohorts, and that we're still kind of not back to the pre-COVID numbers of TK students. That's still prior to expansion. So we can say that TK is not expanding or getting back to the numbers that it was at before COVID, but we can't tell you very much at all about how they're doing at this point. All right, let's see. Another question, this one from Sacramento. You find that TK's positive outcomes fade by 3rd and 4th grade. What could cause it?
Yeah, and it's a good, I think we've addressed this a little bit, and I think just thinking about the fade, Again, it's kind of relative to some of those early studies that looked at kindergarten readiness and scores. And in a lot of early childhood, certainly not all, but a lot of early childhood settings, when we just look at test scores, they're not always a good metric of the skills that were gained in TK. And so that's where, you do see indications of fade out. And in other studies that can follow students longer or have more robust metrics, like the social and emotional metric that we had, you sometimes see, some of these, what you might think of as like intermediate benefits that persist over time. And so it's just to say that students are entering kindergarten more prepared. The students that didn't have TK, maybe they're catching up a little bit. And so that they're, when it comes to third and fourth grade, at least on math and English, it doesn't look like we see large differences. Now, again, this is just for 5 districts. It's relative to the options that were available to those kids, which unfortunately we weren't able to identify. And it's also the early TK cohorts too. So we could certainly imagine that effects would evolve over time. I mean, those in the kind of first TK cohorts, there were larger class sizes. It wasn't as often to be full day. There's still more issues that were being sorted out with the exact kind of credentials and staffing. And so I think, it's reasonable and probably likely to expect that, as the program evolved, and certainly as it evolves during, its expansion phase, we might see some differences in what these impacts are, not just on test scores, but perhaps on this, looking at identification and social emotional needs. So it's definitely, this isn't the answer that's kind of applicable to all cohorts and all settings. This is just one, indication that we have, and I think it's crucial to kind of keep studying and trying to look at it, especially in the rigorous of ways as we can, to try to really make sure that this implementation, is successful going forward beyond just kind of the date that all students have TK available.
Great. And then we have another question about TK expansion from Los Angeles, kind of what the latest numbers tell us about TK expansion. I'll start out there. So right now, the last school year was actually the first school year in which the eligibility expanded. And so there were 2 more months of birth dates that were TK eligible. And this year's added another 2 months. So now I think birth dates between September 2nd and April 2nd are eligible for TK. We don't yet have the counts available from CDE. I think those are coming sometime soonish. So we don't even know yet how many students kind of took up during that expansion year. And as I mentioned before, the year that for which we have the most recent data, the 21-22 school year, we're still not back up to the counts that were enrolled in TK in the pre-pandemic year of 2019-20. And we definitely could not follow those students yet in our data. So we very much want to do that in the future, but we're stuck with the pre-pandemic cohorts for now. Let's see. And then the last, possibly the last question, depending on how fast we are, Julien, is this one's from San Diego. Now that these younger 4-year-olds are coming into the cohorts, do we think that they'll have the same outcomes as students in our study?
I mean, it's a good question. I think it's hard to say. In a way, this is what depends and gets back to understanding, what the modality of TK is like, and is it, how it's going to change when you have younger and younger 4-year-olds, and these expanded cohorts. I think just, making sure that this curriculum, and certainly there's a lot of work being done to ensure that it's age appropriate and that it's the highest quality possible. And making sure that that's applied as well, not just in some, but kind of across the state, right? That those standards are upheld everywhere. I think that's going to be key. And so, again, it's not that younger kids could have better or worse impacts. I think it'll just be is the program going to be able to address their kind of developmental needs that are maybe a little bit more unique when we start getting into those younger and younger 4-year-olds.
Great. Well, I think that is about all we have time for today. Julien, I really want to thank you so much for your presentation. I'd also like to thank our funder, Sunlight Giving, for supporting this research and for supporting today's program. And thank you very much to all of you who joined us online. If you did pre-register for this event, later today you'll receive a survey, and it would be helpful to us if you could take just a minute or two to respond so that we know how we did and hopefully can do better. And thank you very much. Have a great day.